500 million? That's how much Mark Carney just committed to making Canada food independent from the United States. Not a subsidy, not a bailout. A declaration that Canada is building the infrastructure to feed itself regardless of what happens at the American border. This morning, Ottawa, Carney standing in a grocery store, announcing strategic investments in greenhouses, meat processing facilities, and supply chains, all designed to eliminate Canadian dependence on American agriculture. Trump thought tariffs would force Canadian submission. Instead, he just funded the exact infrastructure that destroys American market access permanently. The beef Canada ships to U.S. slaughterhouses, building Canadian processing plants. The vegetables imported from California, building year-round greenhouses. The integrated food system that took decades to build, Canada's systematically dismantling it. And Trump can't stop it because he created the justification. Here's what just happened. For decades, Canada and the United States operated as a single integrated food system. Canadian farmers shipped beef and pork south. American produce moved north. Supply chains crossed the border dozens of times before food reached grocery stores. The entire system was built on one assumption: trade would remain open, tariffs would stay low, and both countries would benefit from specialization. Then Trump started his tariff war: 25% on Canadian steel, 35% on non-trade agreement goods, threats of 100% tariffs if Canada makes deals with China. Suddenly, the integrated North American food system became a weapon Trump could use for political leverage. Canadian farmers watched export markets collapse. Beef cattle prices dropped 22%. Pork exports fell 8%. Canola shipments to the United States declined sharply. Meanwhile, Canadian grocery prices surged 6.2% year over year as supply chains fractured and costs got passed to consumers. Trump thought economic pain would force Canada to accept American terms on everything. Instead, he gave Carney the justification to do what Canada should have done decades ago: build food sovereignty, invest in domestic supply chains, create greenhouse capacity for vegetables that currently come from California, strengthen infrastructure so Canadian food stays in Canada first. Let me break down exactly what Carney announced and why it terrifies American agricultural exporters. The centerpiece is $500 million from the Strategic Response Fund specifically designated to help food businesses address supply chain disruption costs without passing those costs to consumers. This isn't a subsidy program. It's infrastructure investment designed to make Canadian food production independent from American supply chains. Canadian food companies can now apply for funding to expand processing capacity, upgrade cold storage facilities, build distribution networks, and strengthen supply chain resilience. The goal is eliminating bottlenecks that currently force Canadian producers to ship food to the United States for processing, then import it back as finished products. Consider meat processing. Canada produces massive amounts of beef and pork, but lacks sufficient domestic processing capacity. Canadian cattle get shipped to American slaughterhouses, processed into cuts, then sold back to Canadian grocery stores at marked-up prices. Trump's tariffs made this system economically insane. The $500 million aims to build Canadian processing facilities that keep meat production entirely domestic. Once those facilities exist, they don't disappear when tariffs end. They become permanent infrastructure that eliminates American market access forever. Then there's the $150 million Food Security Fund targeting small and medium businesses. This money goes specifically toward expanding greenhouses and strengthening local food production. Canada currently imports enormous quantities of fresh vegetables from California and Mexico because domestic greenhouse capacity can't meet demand. That dependency becomes a strategic vulnerability when Trump threatens tariffs. The new funding allows Canadian greenhouse operators to expand rapidly. And critically, there's a new immediate expensing provision for greenhouse buildings. Any company that acquires a greenhouse operational before 2030 can write off the entire cost immediately. That's a massive tax incentive to build domestic vegetable production capacity. Right now, here's why this matters strategically. Canada has been expanding greenhouse vegetable production aggressively over the past decade. British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec now have substantial operations growing tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and lettuce year-round. The new funding accelerates that expansion exponentially. Within 5 years, Canada could be completely self-sufficient in greenhouse vegetables, eliminating billions in imports from the United States. And greenhouse technology has advanced dramatically. Modern greenhouses use LED lighting, climate control, and hydroponic growing methods, allowing year-round production even in Canadian winters. It's energy-intensive, but increasingly cost-competitive. With field-grown imports, when you factor in transportation and tariffs, there's also $20 million for food banks through the Local Food Infrastructure Fund. This helps community food programs deliver more nutritious food to families in need. But it also creates demand for Canadian-produced food at the community level, strengthening local supply chains and reducing dependence on imported products. Trump didn't understand that threatening food security is existential. Countries accept economic pain in other sectors, but threaten their ability to feed their population, and governments act decisively. Trump's tariffs hit Canadian farmers hard. The pain was immediate, and political pressure on Carney was intense. Traditional response would have been negotiating with Washington, offering concessions on dairy or lumber to get agriculture tariffs reduced, accept American terms to restore market access. But Carney took a different approach, used Trump's tariffs as justification to invest in food independence, told farmers that relying on American markets was the problem, not the solution, promised government support to build domestic processing, expand greenhouses, and strengthen Canadian supply chains. This is permanent structural change. Once Canada builds meat processing facilities, greenhouse operations, and distribution networks for domestic markets, they don't disappear when tariffs end. They become permanent infrastructure that reduces Canadian dependence on American agriculture, regardless of future trade relationships. American agricultural exporters are realizing what this means. Canada is a major market for U.S. produce, processed foods, and agricultural products. If Canada becomes self-sufficient in key categories, those export markets disappear permanently. Trump's tariffs aren't just hurting current sales, they're destroying future market access. The food plan isn't happening in isolation. It's part of Carney's comprehensive strategy to reduce Canadian dependence on the United States across multiple sectors. There's the Buy Canadian procurement policy redirecting $70 billion to domestic suppliers over 5 years. There's the Arctic infrastructure investment, building shipping routes to Europe and Asia. There's the China trade deal unlocking agricultural exports to the world's largest consumer market. Every move reduces the leverage Trump's tariffs can generate. The food plan fits perfectly into this framework. By investing in domestic food production and processing, Canada reduces both imports from the United States and dependence on American supply chains. That makes Trump's agricultural tariffs less effective as economic weapons. Consider the strategic sequence. Trump threatens Canadian agriculture with tariffs. Canadian farmers initially panic. Carney responds with investment in domestic food infrastructure. Farmers realize they can serve Canadian markets without exporting to the United States. Greenhouse operators expand rapidly with government support. Within 5 years, Canada is largely self-sufficient in key food categories. At that point, Trump's agricultural tariffs become irrelevant. Canadian producers aren't exporting to the United States anymore. They're serving domestic demand. And American agricultural exporters have permanently lost market share in Canada to domestic producers who benefited from Carney's investment programs. This is economic judo. Trump applies pressure through tariffs. Carney uses that pressure to justify investments that permanently reduce Canadian vulnerability to future pressure. The harder Trump pushes, the faster Canada builds independence. Carney announced this plan in a grocery store rather than at a farm for specific political reasons. Canadians are angry about food prices. Statistics Canada data shows grocery costs up 6.2% year. That's above overall inflation and hitting household budgets hard. Food price increases are politically toxic. Carney can't stop inflation directly, but he can blame Trump for supply chain disruptions driving prices higher. And he can announce government action to protect Canadians from those disruptions. That's what the $500 million plan does politically. By framing the investment as protecting Canadians from Trump's tariffs, Carney makes it popular, even with voters who might oppose government intervention in markets. Nobody wants higher grocery prices. If government spending can keep costs down while building Canadian food independence, that's a political winner. It also neutralizes conservative opposition. Opposition parties can't attack $500 million in new spending without appearing to side with Trump against Canadian interests, and the investments have long-term economic benefits beyond the immediate tariff crisis. Building greenhouse capacity creates jobs. Expanding meat processing strengthens rural economies. Improving food supply chains reduces costs for all Canadians. Carney gets to spend $500 million restructuring Canadian agriculture to be less dependent on the United States. And he gets credit for protecting grocery prices. That's politically brilliant. American farmers and agricultural exporters are understanding the long-term implications of Trump's tariff strategy. Canada is a major export market for U.S. agricultural products, fresh produce, processed foods, meat products, grains. Billions in annual trade flow north. Much of that trade happens because Canada lacks domestic processing capacity or year-round production for certain products. Trump's tariffs gave Canada the political justification and economic incentive to build that capacity domestically. Every dollar Canada invests in greenhouses, processing facilities, and supply chain infrastructure is future American exports disappearing permanently. Consider beef processing. Canada currently ships cattle to U.S. slaughterhouses because it lacks sufficient domestic capacity. Those cattle get processed in American facilities, providing jobs in rural American communities. If Canada builds its own processing facilities with the new fund, those American jobs disappear. Or greenhouse vegetables. California produces enormous quantities of tomatoes, peppers, lettuce that get shipped to Canadian grocery stores. If Canada achieves self-sufficiency through greenhouse expansion, California growers lose a major export market permanently. American agricultural groups lobbied against Trump's tariffs specifically because they understood the long-term market access implications. But Trump ignored those concerns, focused on using tariffs as leverage for other political objectives. The result is what American agricultural exporters feared. Canada is using Trump's tariffs as justification to build permanent domestic capacity that will reduce American market access for decades. The investments are happening now, but benefits accrue over years in ways Trump can't reverse. Greenhouse operations take time to build. Companies need land, facilities, climate control systems, workers, supply relationships with grocery stores, multi-year process. But once operational, greenhouses produce vegetables year-round indefinitely. Meat processing facilities are similar. Building a slaughterhouse requires significant capital investment and regulatory approval. But once operational, it provides permanent domestic capacity independent of cross-border trade. The immediate expensing tax incentive for greenhouses operational before 2030 creates urgency. Companies have for years to build and qualify for the tax benefit. Expect greenhouse construction to boom as companies rush to meet the deadline. By 2030, Canada's food landscape will look completely different. Substantial domestic greenhouse capacity, providing year-round vegetables. Expanded meat processing, keeping Canadian livestock production domestic. Strengthened supply chains, reducing import dependence. Trump can't stop this process. Investments are funded through Canadian government programs using Canadian money. They're happening in Canada using Canadian resources. Trump's only leverage is threatening more tariffs, which just reinforces the case for Canadian food independence. Even if Trump reverses tariff policies tomorrow, the investments won't stop. Once Canadian companies see the economic opportunity in serving domestic markets without cross-border trade complexity, they'll continue building capacity regardless of tariff status. The $500 million food plan is only the first step in a larger transformation of Canadian agriculture and food systems. There's the expansion of the National School Food Program, providing meals to 400,000 children annually. That creates guaranteed demand for Canadian-produced food and supports local producers. There's the broader $70 billion by Canadian procurement initiative, including food purchases for government facilities, military bases, hospitals. Every dollar spent on Canadian-produced food strengthens domestic supply chains. There's ongoing negotiation with provinces to reduce interprovincial trade barriers for agricultural products. Currently, it's often easier for Canadian producers to export to the United States than sell to other provinces. Fixing that increases the domestic market available to Canadian farmers and food processors. And there's the China trade deal that unlocked $4 billion in canola exports to the world's largest consumer market. That diversifies export markets away from U.S. dependence. All these initiatives create a Canadian food system that is more self-sufficient domestically and more diversified in export markets. The result is permanent reduction in vulnerability to American tariff threats. Trump thought threatening Canadian agriculture would give him leverage. Instead, he catalyzed a transformation that makes Canada permanently less dependent on American markets and supply chains, not leverage. Strategic failure. The $500 million food plan is Canada turning Trump's biggest weapon into its greatest opportunity. And American agricultural exporters are just beginning to understand what they lost.